Kaki te umere, he ao, ka watia, ti hei, Māori ora.
Thank you, Eru. Welcome everyone to this session on Māori future making, an Indigenous approach to social innovation. I'm Russ Gaskin with CoCreative, and we're joined by my colleague Melissa Darnell, who will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions or needs, I see there's one about muting. Yes, we can mute, but we were busy letting people in and taking care of opening the session. But yeah, so if you're able to kind of self-mute when needed, please do that. And we're really excited about this session. And I have several beliefs about this session, knowing Eru and some of the team there. One, it's going to be fun. Number two, you're probably going to want to go to New Zealand and you're probably going to want to join their team. I don't know if they're accepting applications now, though. I think you're going to get a lot of rich thinking and learning in the short period of time we have together. Here's some good stories, and I think come away with some maybe different ways of thinking, fresh ways of thinking about some work that you might be engaging in. So CoCreative is a consultancy that does training on systems change, support a bunch of collaborations. One of the things we like to do is to bring forward diverse voices from the field that are bringing forward wisdom that CoCreative maybe doesn't leverage in its own work, or maybe not even be that familiar with. But as we're enriching our own learning, we thought, well, let's share the learning with more people in our community. And so this series is really about bringing forward those voices that we think have really rich things to offer. In this case, we've worked a bit with Eru and Billy and some of the team there at Māori Futures Collective on a process model around the framework that you're going to be hearing about in this session. I also want to note Lainey Goodchild is here. Many of you know when you registered, you donated to a fund, and Eru said, I don't know, it's not very New Zealander of us to accept donations for ourselves for our own webinar. And so he chose to designate the recipient of the donations as Turtle Island Institute. So near the end of the session, we'll hear a bit also from Mulaney about the work of Turtle Island Institute that we're collectively supporting, at least financially, in this work. So I do want to take a moment here of silence for a land acknowledgement. For some of us, this may be acknowledging our ancestors and the land that is our historical and traditional land. For others, it may be our ancestors were settlers, or we moved into a territory that is the traditional land of a people who have cared for that land for centuries before we stepped foot on it. So feel free, if you like, to note where you're joining from to honor the traditional people of that land, or just take a moment here with the rest of us in silence to honor the resilience and the courage and the legacies of these people. If you're not familiar with the traditional peoples in the land that you inhabit now, you'll note at the bottom of the slide, there's a website, native-land.ca, where you can go and actually look, and you'll see much more granular views than what you see here. This doesn't even capture a tenth of the diversity of peoples, for example, in North America. And you'll see other parts of the world too. I know we have folks joining from some other parts who aren't, whose lands aren't represented on this map. So we'd like to, before we jump forward here, Eru and the team at Te Kona Teraki they're going to introduce themselves in a bit. We would like you to share a bit about who's joining us today. And so we've opened a poll. You can browse on your phone or your computer to the website slido.com. enter the code KIAORA, Kiaora, and you'll be put into this to this Slido poll. And please share there your name and organization, where you're joining from today. Ideally, a place we can find on a map after the session. When we send some follow-up resources in the session recording, we'll include a map showing where we're all from.
Yeah, I mean, assuming.
And then one value that consistently informs your life and work. All right. Oh, Think Place New Zealand. All right. Peter McKenzie project got a lot of Kiwi representation, which I think we were anticipating to some extent. Some members of Mulaney's team at Turtle Island Institute. Gosh, you know, I knew with this webinar with Adrian and his team that we were going to get many of our favorite friends and colleagues. And Melissa's, I think, seeing the same thing. Welcome, Dan Benjamin from the UK. A couple of Think Place folks. Deb Holliday, who just had a great piece with the Collective Impact Forum on collective impact and systems change in rural communities. Welcome, everyone. As I scroll through this, just consider all these people in different parts of the world working on behalf of communities, on behalf of the earth, on behalf of others. All right, this is where we're joining from. Sao Paulo. Wonderful. Again, we'll share out a map here. Now, the one we love the best. What's one value that consistently informs our lives and our work? Respect, integrity. So on a word cloud, you'll see the ones that were mentioned more are larger. So some core values of respect, integrity, equity, justice, compassion, trust, empathy. One of those long Māori words that I can't pronounce, but maybe Eru can. A value of we will never be free until we are all free. Beautiful. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Ada, I think we're over to you, so I'll start up your slides here.
Tēnā koutou I ngā iwi ko tūhono mai, ko Iruira Tārena tōku ingoa, mai ngā iwi o Ngaitahu, Ngāti Pro, me te whānau apanui, e tuku I te reo mihi kia koutou katoa. So kia ora everyone, my name's Iruira Tārena. I whakapapa or descend from 3 tribes, Ngaitahu, which is the main iwi in New Zealand, South Island. Ngāti Pro and Te Whānau Apanui, which are on the East Coast and the East Cape of the North Island. So very much East Coast genealogy. And I'm the Executive Director of Tokona Te Raki, which is Māori Futures Collective, which is an Indigenous social innovation lab that's housed under the mana, under the authority of my iwi Ngaitahu, which is from New Zealand, South Island. And so we kind of think ourselves as part think tank, part do tank, and we have a Māori Futures Academy, which does research and also trains our young people in an Indigenous approach to social innovation. We have a Māori Futures Lab, which is where we work on big complex issues and facilitate what we say is our kawa or our protocol of innovation and collaborative innovation. And then we also have a Māori Futures Academy, which is where we connect partners and organizations with young change makers. And so a big part of our work is our young people get opportunities to do apprenticeships in plumbing and drain laying. Why wouldn't we want them to do an apprenticeship in changing the world? And so rather than putting them through public policy and teaching them BAU, we're trying to focus on how do we create an apprenticeship in Māori future making and basically support our people, in particular our young people, in a sense of building their capability to be leading change and be equipped with strategies to lead change and tools. So if you could chuck those slides back up again, Russ. Thank you. So what we're really sharing, I suppose, if you think about social innovation, we've been trying to figure out, well, what does an Indigenous process look like? And once we figure out a process, how do we then build a team and create spaces? And so have an Indigenous process, an Indigenous team, and an Indigenous spaces to be leading change. And we also think that part of that has been what we call te kore koreka. And so in our language, kore means nothing. And so kore, nothing, which means kind of, I suppose, abundance from our end. So being limitless, being able to push through the constraints of our lived experience of the present, and being able to reclaim our kind of navigator mindset and imagine an alternative future beyond that which we've experienced. And we do sit in a space where, we have a colonized past and present. How do we have a process that helps us not only decolonize and move away from things, but also start to think around, well, how do we re-indigenize the future and create a future that's better than the past and present that we've experienced? And so for us, we call that a kawa, and a kawa is a protocol, a practice, and a process. And that's something that we understand, because when you go to if anyone's been lucky enough to go to one of our marae, our meeting houses in our Māori communities, we have very clear protocols around how we behave, how we engage, and our rituals of welcome. And so for us, do you call it a framework, a methodology, a model? Those are kind of words that just confuse people and make your aunties angry. And so a kawa for us is useful because it's a protocol, a practice. It's kind of conceptual and practical all at the same time. Next slide, Russ. So just a bit about us. So Tukuna Te Raki, it comes from our creation traditions, our name. And we have this beautiful tradition from an ancestor, Matiaha Tira Morehu, and our creation tradition is titled Te Waiatatanga Mai o Ngā Atua. So we have a manuscript which basically says how the universe was sung into being, and it gives a concise and very clear account of our creation tradition. And so our name comes from that. And for those from overseas, we have two key deities in our creation tradition, Rangi Nui or Raki Nui in our dialect, the Sky Father, and Papa Tuanuku, the Earth Mother. And they were close together. And so all of their children, before creation, they were in an embrace. And so their children couldn't stand up. They had to crawl around in the darkness on all fours. And so Tāne Mahuta set about to separate his parents, and he used 3 po. So him and his brother Paia lifted their father up into the heavens and basically created space to allow light, energy, potential, and life to emerge into the world. And so we call that te ao marama. So that process of separation, he used a po or a post called po tū te raki, and his brother Paia also set up 2 other po, korua tipua and korua tawhito. So there were 3 posts that raised the heavens and held the heavens up and allowed the gods, the deities, to stand up, to stretch, but they also allowed light, potential, energy, and life to emerge into the world. And so that's our account of creation. And you can kind of see those weaving patterns that are connecting those posts together. And so, in that tradition, it wasn't one post that could hold up the sky, but really it was the 3 posts working together that raised the ceilings of our heavens to allow new possibilities to emerge. And part of that process, we have this thing of rangi tuku tuku, that the heavens and the earth were bound together by these bindings. And if you go to our marae, you can see our tuku panels, they're woven panels. And so really that idea that in order for change to occur, we need to go around and unweave the bindings and unlearn our behaviors in order for potential shift to occur. But once we raise the ceilings of the heavens and put those po in place, then we have to go around and reweave and relearn everything. And so that's kind of our metaphor for our practice, that originally we probably thought change is kind of a physical sort of shunting posts into place, when really as we've gone along, we've learned that probably what's really critical to our process is that practice of unlearning the way we've been doing things and unbinding everything so it can actually flex and shift and move. And then once we do that and create a shift, how do we then reweave the heavens so that everything is sitting nice and tight and those po are supporting each other? So for us, that's kind of a cultural metaphor for collaboration, really, and a process of change. And it's not that different, really, when we look at the circumstances of a lot of our whānau, that there are constraints, that people can't live their best lives. And our practice has got to be, well, how do we raise the ceilings of the heavens to let in new light and new potential into their worlds? Next slide, Russ. A wee while back, we kind of try to just map, well, what are all of the influences? And so when we think about social innovation, it doesn't sit within it sits within a context. And so we've had lots of influences and, been influenced by social innovation. I think Russ mentioned collective impact, design thinking, systems thinking. So we had a whole bunch of tools and frameworks, and we experimented with sharing and using these in our communities. But we also started to probably get a little bit confused, and my brain's a bit like a filing cabinet. I had so many tools and frameworks and models and methodologies, and they were all kind of good at one point in time. But the irony of it is you kind of don't have good systems for talking about systems. It's quite nerdy language. And when we engage with our own people, it kind of just, our own people get a bit frustrated, and it's too nerdy and a bit long-winded. And so we also started to map out, well, what are those big influences in our culture and our tribe, and really looking at things like critical pedagogy, kaupapa Māori, and then also, as I mentioned before, key thinkers and what we call tohunga, or I think shaman's not quite the right word, but yeah, those cultural experts in our traditions. And so really when we look at that, starting to look at, well, how do we not rely on bringing in Western solutions and Western frameworks and models to fix broken Western systems that aren't working for our people? And really, how do we start to trust ourselves as the source of our own solutions, and in particular, our own cultural narratives and culture? And so that's really how we kind of came about to this thing we call Māori future making, which is really how do we stop borrowing everyone else's solutions and start coming up with some of our own. Next slide, Russ. So we did a kind of a quirky thing, but we had our creation tradition, and we have karakia, incantations or prayers. And I think one day we just started playing with that and color coded it. And one of the things we noticed, and I'll just have a quote here from Māori Marsden, who's from Te Tai Tokero, an amazing thinker and tohunga. But he describes it, that the Māori worldview is a three-world view, that you have potential symbolized by te kore kore or te kore, the world of becoming portrayed by te pō, and the world of being by te ao marama. And in our creation traditions, we kind of have these phases of nothingness, of night, and of day. And what we noticed in our own karakia is that they're not linear. So we didn't sort of start off with nothing in creation, then to the world of night, and then to the world of day. It's cyclical. And so we kind of start off in Te Pō, a little bit of Te Kore, and moving into Te Pō again, and then through into Te Ao Marama. And so what we started to build was sort of a cyclical approach where we have Te Ao Tūro, like the world of now, our current state, being able to step out of that world into the world of Te Kore, where we release ourselves from the busyness of our daily lives and enter a space where we can reflect and think about the past, and then kind of build a bit more of a clear intent around where we want to go to. And Te Pō, which is for us the world of night, and often in Māoridom is associated with death, but is also the world associated with creativity and life. And when we think of the womb, like the womb is Te Pō, you know, that when we are growing our Te Whare Tangata, the house of procreation, that is the world of Pō, and they are birthed into the world of Te Ao Marama. And so Te Pō for us is really that stepping into the future and the world of innovation, of design, of making, and then coming back into Te Ao Marama, which is the world of light, the world of positivity. And in particular, when we think about Indigenous peoples, we kind of go, well, Te Ao Tūro is very much like our colonized state, you know, that we have our tensions and our challenges. How do we step back into our past and reclaim our culture as the source of our solutions? How do we step into the future and to go, well, what's the future we want that we determine? And so when we make that return into Te Ao, it's not going back into Te Ao Tūro and the world as it was, but it's going back to Te Ao Marama, a better world, and creating a future state which is slightly more Indigenous than the one we left behind in Te Ao Tūro. Next slide, Russ. And so in a linear sense, you know, what we've been working on, I suppose, is a conceptual model that guides an approach to design and systems change that comes from our own Indigenous traditions, but also trying to figure out, well, how do we create a practice? And so we have our sort of cyclical piece, which is the conceptual part. And then we also found that we have people like myself that love ideas, and then we also have other relations that just like doing stuff, and they got frustrated with me waffling on all the time. And so we developed more of a linear approach that was more practical. And when we have, when we think of our traditions, we have kawairunga, kawairaro, so even our cultural traditions, there's kind of the upper jawbone of esoteric lore and astronomy, astrology, and all of that kind of knowledge. And then you have the lower jawbone, which is like kawairaro, the practical knowledge of how to build a canoe that won't sink, you know. And so when we think about that, we think of the cyclical model as our kawairunga, our sort of conceptual model. And then, yeah, how do we build a practical and applied toolkit that's for the doers? And so this is our kawairaro, our linear approach, where Te Ao Tūro, knowing, doing, reviewing, which is kind of the world we get stuck in. Te Kore, which is that seeking, reflecting, and understanding. Te Pō, really that space of imagining, designing, and making, and actually manifesting. And really then getting into Te Ao Marama and the realization, all of that coming into fruition. Can you, next slide, please, Russ? And so partly, that's kind of where we're at. These are some of the illustrations we've been working with as well. And so we're also starting to build atuatanga into this approach and trying to think of how do we kind of create archetypes based around our deities, you know, that can kind of represent the human parts and dynamics of what does it feel like in each of these states. And so that's something we're sort of moving into now. But those illustrations for us kind of capture, you know, the excitement and anticipation of going on a journey, that real release of te kore and stepping out of the busyness of the world of do to be able to free yourself up. Embracing potential and ambiguity in te pō, and really that, you know, sort of the creative spirit, and then really that bringing all of that into fruition into Te Ao Marama. And so that's partly, I suppose, moving from the conceptual to the practical to even from the systemic to the human parts, and to go, well, how do we start to slice in and drawing upon the archetypes of our atua, our deities, our cultural gods, to go, yeah, how does that feel, and what are the characteristics that you need to embody in these different phases of a process of transformation. And probably the key thing I forgot to add is the purpose of this. It's not about incremental change. It's about, transformation. And we've done plenty of incremental change over the past decades. Really, we need to create a better future for our people. And that's the purposes of this kaupapa. So when we think about that, we think of mana motu hake, the ability to move from dependency to being self-determining as a people. Next slide, Russ. I suppose just a key thing I would share is, cultural collaboration or cross-cultural collaboration can feel like you kind of got two different ways of dancing, and you end up stepping on each other's toes all the time. So part of it is we have the challenge of how do we translate principles into practice. And so in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have a Te Tiriti, that is our founding partnership between our Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And it's embedded in lots of, in laws and all sorts of things, but it's largely in terms, captured in principles. And what we've been trying to figure out was how do we sort of translate that into practice and not just have treaty principles, but have treaty-based approaches and practices to make that work. And so often, if you have a cultural gathering and you have two groups and you don't have a kawa, you don't have a practice or an agreed upon way of working, then, disasters can happen despite good intent. And as I said, it's kind of like, two awkward people dancing, stepping on each other's toes. And so for us, the kawa, our practice, our process, the framework for how we go about design and systems change is drawn from ancestral wisdom, and it's our way of kind of navigating complexity. Next slide, Russ. And probably the key thing, I suppose, in terms of that is to reframe it, to go, well, how do we wean ourselves off the need of needing to jump on the next fad in terms of silver bullets, or sort of avoid the seduction of the illusion of a silver bullet, to start to look inward and to go, well, how can the solutions from our most grand challenges come from us, and draw upon the wisdom of our past as a means to be creating the future. And so I'm going to hand over in a second, but I suppose a big part of our mahi is not just building an Indigenous approach to social innovation, but it's also really building an intergenerational Indigenous approach to social innovation. And so our big, I suppose, theory of change is that if we can support our young people to do an apprenticeship in Māori future making, and they are equipped with the tools, techniques, and strategies to lead change, then that's what's going to be the most powerful force in terms of transformation for our people. So ka te aui konei, I'm now going to hand over and introduce you. We'll ask our rangatahi team of innovators to introduce themselves, and this is our youth team. So kia ora tātou.
Ka tira tātou. E te pō, tēnā koe. Kia tuatai ake he mihi arorangi kia koe, Russ. Koutou ko tō hāpai o e whakapau kaha nei kia whanake ai te anamata. E mea ana te kōrero me tika a muri, kia tika a mua. Nō reira, kei ngai whakapiripiri o te wā nei ka mihi. Ka rie, ka rere te whakaaro ki ngā whenua take, ngā iwi take, puta noa i o koutou ao. E o mātou hoa mōrehu, ka tukuna te wairua o aroha, o mihi, o kaha hoki kia koutou, mea koutou, e whawhai tonu rā. Ka tingi, kei tō tātou piringa huitopa, nei rā mātou e mihi kau atu, nau mai, tauti mai ki tō mātou nei wāhanga o te hui topa. Fantastic, welcome everyone. It's lovely to have you all with us this morning. To translate briefly, I began by acknowledging Russ and the team at CoCreative and making note of all the efforts that culminate in things like this webinar. I then extended greetings and acknowledgements to the ancestral lands and Indigenous peoples of each of your parts of the world before extending those same greetings and acknowledgements to each of you, our esteemed guests. Just a quick overview of what's going to happen in the next 15 odd minutes. We'll begin shortly by introducing ourselves. Then we'll have Mato here take us through an overview of Te CoCreative before you'll join Maddie, myself and Hine Pounamu and delving a little bit deeper into each of the realms mentioned earlier. Then we'll return to Mato, who will give us a bit of an update on what next for Te CoCreative before we come back to the couch and wrap things up together. I'll hand you all over to Maddie now, if she'll do us the honour of kicking things off.
Kia ora, nei te mihi nui kia koutou, ko Madison Simons tōku ingoa, huri tēnei no ngai tahu Ngāti Whātua te roroa me Ngāti Kahungunu, he kai arahi o aha mō tōkuna tiraki. Kia ora, I am Maddie and I am the Rangatahi Labs Director for Tōkuna Tiraki. I have been here for just over a year now and have the privilege of leading our rangatahi in the Māori Futures Academy. Absolutely love being on Te CoCreative as a project and just recognise the development and change that has occurred over the time we've been working on it, and just with the inclusion of our rangatahi now to see where that might go. So kia ora.
Kia ora no tātou katoa, ko te mata Flanagan tōku ingoa. He uri tēnei no ngā iwi o ngātai me Ngāti Manawhatu, nei rata mi kia koutou katoa. My name is Mato Flanagan and I am one of the rangatahi who are part of the academy this year. And yeah, my understanding of Te CoCreative is quite shallow, but hopefully planning on expanding on the idea because I understand with the Te CoCreative framework, it can help with my navigation in today's environment. So kia ora anō tātou.
Tēnā koe Mato. Ko te pō tamatia kei runga, ko whakaraupo kei raro, ko rāpaki te rā, te pito o te kore, te pō te ao, te pūtaki o te kikotanga me ki, e tane whāna ara, ko Awhioraki koro tēnei e mihi atu. Kia ora, my name's Awhi or Awhioraki Whalong. Te pō tamatia, the lofty mountain looms above, te whakaraupo, the sea glistens below, and rāpaki, the center of the universe, lies there, and that's where I'm from. I'm one of the rangatahi here, also part of the academy, and I've been a part of the Te CoCreative project for a couple of months now. For me, Te CoCreative is about the intersection between change and tradition. Our traditional knowledge often seems obsolete in the hustle and bustle of the day-to-day, but Te CoCreative offers an opportunity to bring all that traditional knowledge into a context that is relevant and useful for us and our people in our daily life. Anyways, that's enough from me. I'll pass you all over to Hine Pounamu now.
Tēnā koe Awhi, o tira tēnā rā tātou, ko Hine Pounamu apanui bā tōku ingoa, he uri no ngai tahu Ngāti Porou me Ngāti Hine. I am Hine Pounamu, I'm one of the rangatahi researchers at Tōkuna Tiraki and have been here since the start of the year. Been on Te CoCreative as a project for coming up to 3 weeks now, so a bit of a newbie compared to these ones, but Te CoCreative was actually my first interaction with Tōkuna Tiraki as an organisation before I was employed here. And for me personally, I, as a young Ngaitahu woman, really strongly resonate with its origins and our creation traditions and our kōrero to do with Matiahatira Morehu and Te Wātatanga Mai. So I've thoroughly enjoyed being part of Te CoCreative and really looking forward to sharing more of the project with you guys over the next 10 minutes. And I am just going to hand it back over to Te Mato, who's going to explain the whakapapa and give an overview of Te CoCreative. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora no tātou katoa, e aku nui aku rahi, nei rata me ka koutou. So yeah, once again, in the past, our Indigenous knowledge, our people, our land and our taonga were continuously suppressed and parts lost forever due to colonization. So it is important that we acknowledge our tipuna, our ancestors and elders who fought for the survival of our taonga, our land and our taonga, and our language, sorry. So, yeah, rātou mā te hunga mā te kia rātou, ā tātou te hunga I te he tonu ana I te Māori ora, e mihana ki a tātou katoa. In our search for a tool of a model for Māori future making, we examined the karikia te waitatanga mai o te pō, which was written by Matihatira Morihu, which explains the creation of Ngaitahu's creation story. Matihatira Morihu is one of Ngaitahu's most important, most influential rangatira chief in the early 19th century. A leader, a tohunga, and an advocate for Ngaitahu land rights. With the karikia, that explains the creation of Ngaitahu in the eyes of Ngaitahu, it examines three key realms. Te kore, the nothingness, te pō, the darkness, and te ao, the light. We examined how each realms act independently and how each of the realms interact with one another. After analyzing the three realms, we also examined what the space and the energy looks like in between the different realms. And furthermore, we broke down the three realms into 4 realms later, which creates our te kore koreka. Te aturua, our current state, a realm of knowing, reviewing, and doing. Then we move from our te aturua, our current state, to te kore, our insights. The realm of understanding and of reflecting. And from there, from te kore, we move to te pō, innovation, a realm of seeking, a realm of creating, imagining. And then we go from te pō to te marama, our future state. And from our future state, I would like to hand it over to our fellow teammates. But before that, I'd like to invite you, our listeners, to make sure you guys write some notes as we navigate through te kore koreka. Tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora anō. Welcome to Te Ao Tūroa. So again, just want to reiterate what Te Matou said. Please feel free to take any notes on the handout that you have in regarding to each of the realms. So we are in Te Ao Tūroa. Te Ao Tūroa, the literal translation means the living world. And we associate that with what is currently happening. So the tangible material world, what we see, feel, touch right now in our current state. So the 3 kupu or words we relate to that are knowing, doing, and reviewing. So to experience that, think of we're driving to work, we've got a to-do list, we're doing emails, we're picking up the kids from school, we're making dinner. It's everything that's in our routine of everyday mahi and life. And so when you're in Te Ao Tūroa, it can become a routine. It can become very comfortable for people to just keep doing as they do. And we know that especially in the realm of systems change and in our mahi, is that the current state doesn't actually support our people. So although it's comfortable to stay how we are and in our own routine, it's really important for us to know that change is necessary and moving out of this space is necessary. It is seen in a negative light because of that, but it also means that this state is where people are learning. It's where we're going to get an education, we're going to work, we're saving to buy a home. So there are the positives and negatives of each. So Te Ao Tūroa is the state of our current state of living in the right now. So I will hand over to Awhi and Te Kore using our karakia to transition. Tukuna te ao kia tū, tukuna te ao kia ora, tukuna te ao kia moi, tukuna te ao kia tupu, kia tuku tuku anō ai te ao, nau mai te kore, ka pou te kore.
Tēnā koe Mary, uti noa tēnā anō tātou, nau mai tauti mai te kore. Welcome to te kore. The literal translation of te kore, as you heard a bit of before, means the nothing. Te translating to the, kore translating to any of, oblivion, annihilation, zero, or nothing. The traditional understanding of te kore is it's the space that exists before the night and then the subsequent dawn of the world. It's the space of infinite potential, and it's the source of everything as we know it. In the context of Te Kore Koreka, Te Kore provides a space to step out of the now, Te Aotearoa, and into the unknown. As Mato mentioned before, we've come up with 3 words that we believe encompasses the experience of Te Kore. They are reflecting, seeking, and understanding. We believe that Te Kore offers a space to reflect on events that have transpired, to seek insights from within those reflections, and further gain understandings from that whole process. Te Kore often allows for a better understanding of the past or whakapapa, genealogy of an issue, and serves as permission to exist within complexity. But what does that really mean? Well, in contrast to the tangibility, certainty, and safety of Te Aotearoa, Te Kore can often feel intangible, uncertain, and unsafe. We believe, however, that Te Kore is the appropriate space to move into first in our Te Kore Koreka process, guiding you out of Te Aotearoa in a way that is less forceful than it often happens. Think less of a forced shift like the fictional Spartan cliff toss, and more of a guided one, like swimming lessons. That's enough from me on Te Kore, and I'll pass you on now to Hine Pounamu with our karakia. Tokuna Te Kore kia tū, tokuna Te Kore kia ora. Tukuna Te Kore kia moe, tukuna Te Kore kia tupu, kia tukutuku anō ai Te Kore. Nau mai te pō, ka pau te pō.
Tēnā koe awhi o tira tēnā rā tātou, and welcome to the realm of Te Pō. As Edu mentioned, Te Pō literally means the darkness or the night, and we know it in our everyday life to be a time of known darkness and a time of dreaming. Within Te Kore Koreka, it is our realm of imagining, designing, and making, and we often refer to it as our innovation state. On a personal note, I find the positioning of our future piece within this framework to be really different to mainstream frameworks of strategic planning, which often lead with the future state, that start with the vision or the goal. The idea of Te Pō being the third realm that we transverse into within this model is the idea that we cannot know what possible futures await us until we know where it is that we have come from. And so we take our evaluations from our current state in Te Aotearoa, our insights from the past in Te Kore, and we enter the realm of Te Pō to innovate for possible solutions. Being intentional in our dreaming and imagining phase opens up the world of possibilities, helping to improve our overall design process. And when facilitating Te Kore Koreka, we encourage really unconstrained imagination. So we ask our participants not to edit themselves, not to think about how they're going to make their future happen, and instead think about the possibilities and think about the solutions that await. Te Pō is our creative and innovative phase of Te Kore Koreka, and we take those dreams forward into Te Ao Marama with the karakia tokona Te Pō kia tū, tokona Te Pō kia ora, tukuna Te Pō kia moe, tukuna Te Pō kia tupu, kia tukutuku anō ai Te Pō, nau mai te ao, ka pau te ao. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and you're back to me in Te Ao Marama. So similarly to what Mato was talking about the cycle, is that yes, it was a linear process through to here, but I also recognise that it's cyclical and we continuously move back around. So Te Ao Marama is, the little translation is the new world, of the world of light, and so it's looking at our future state. So we've learned from each of our previous ao and phases. Te Aotearoa, what's going on right now? What do we know about our people, about our communities, about our problems right now? We step into Te Kore to look back and learn on the whakapapa and learn about the whakapapa of each of those problems and the communities that we're working with. Then we step into Te Pō to go, what could we dream of? What could be our reality? How do we make that happen? What is that future reality that we seek so much? And then Te Ao Marama is a beautiful phase because it's making that a reality. Originally, Te Ao Marama wasn't a part of Te Kore Koreka, originally based off our initial mahi with the karakia. But we recognised that actually when we move into Te Ao Marama, we need a new space. We needed somewhere new to step into, to let go of the things of the past, to let go of Te Ao Tūroa and move collectively into Te Ao Marama, into a new space of understanding and recognising the full potential. So Te Ao Marama is very reliant on ensuring that we step through those other phases. The three kupu that we associate with this realm are implementing, sharing and influencing. And it's beautiful because we know that when we go here, we start working with our people, working with our communities based off all the learnings of the previous ao. So I will hand you back to Te Mātou to wrap up where we're at and what we're looking at moving forward with Te Kore Korenga. Kia ora.
Kia kua mai, tēnā koutou katoa, ia koutou kōrero, mo te kore koreka. So lastly, I'll just wrap us up with a brief run through of what we are currently doing and what's next for Te Kore Koreka. So we are looking at rebranding because initially Te Kore Koreka was a tool created by our Pakeke. So with the addition of rangatahi, new ideas and new whakaaro, new thoughts are able to sprout. And with those new thoughts comes new possibilities. So yeah, there comes our idea for a new narrative for Te Kore Koreka. It also opens up another door for our wider Māori community across the Aotearoa. So we are excited to see what the future holds for our new narrative. So maybe the next time you see us, we might change from Te Kore Koreka to a different name. So yeah, keep in touch. And second, we are looking at our creating a Te Kore Koreka website, name to be confirmed. But again, it's a tool for our Māori across the world. So it's easy to access. And it's also a tool that our Indigenous people, our Indigenous communities throughout the Motu, throughout New Zealand and throughout the world can use and learn from. So yeah, it's a sharing kind of tool that is open. So yeah, use it if you can and use it if you want. And lastly, we are looking at translating our document, our founding document. At the moment, it's written in English. However, with the addition of rangatahi and rangatahi who are fluent in te reo Māori, new ideas and new whakaaro, new perspectives will hopefully shine from the translation of that document. And hopefully that Māori document sits as our foundation. And from there, I don't know, the possibilities for Te Kore Koreka are endless. So yeah, very excited to see how it goes and very excited to work with the team that I have now. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to the rest.
Kia ora whānau. So firstly, just wanted to thank you all for jumping on the webinar and taking the time out of your day, depending on what time zone you're in, to be here and listen to kōrero on Te Kore Koreka, on Tōkuna Tiraki, and to see some of the amazingness that our rangatahi hold being in this space. What I'm really looking forward to with Te Kore Korenga moving forward is the addition of our rangatahi and the mātauranga and knowledge that they hold, but also recognise how exciting it is to have Russ and CoCreative contribute to Te Kore Korenga, and just seeing the development of having all of those people contributing and supporting us. But I would like to throw the tono or the wero a challenge to our whānau. I see how much Te Kore Korenga is developed with our young people involved. So the challenge to you is go out and see your youth, go out and see your young people and get them involved in the mahi and work that you do. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Mary. O tino tēnā anō tātou. Brilliant. Just like to thank you all, like I'm sure the others are feeling, really grateful for the attention and time that you've given us all this morning while we share Te Kore Koreka with you. On a personal note, I'd like to think that Te Kore Koreka has inspired you to act and be like, wait for it, one of our boss's favourite metaphors, a turtle. To step away from the busyness of the day-to-day and take time to see what exists outside. The ocean, the ocean, outside the ocean. Also, Mullaney, and Turtle Island. Great kaupapa. Yeah, that's definitely enough from me. And with that, I'll sign off and hand you all over to Mato.
Kia ora, it's me again. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed our kōrero. And yeah, this is an invite to you guys to, and maybe the next project that you guys go through, or whatever troubles you go through, that maybe you can use Te Kore Koreka and to help you deal with that problem and hopefully come up with a new solution. So yeah, that's my little spiel, and I'll hand it over to Hine Pounamu.
Tēnā koe. I would just like to tautoko support the acknowledgements of my team to you all that have joined us this morning. Have really enjoyed going into this space and explaining a bit of the mahi that we do, and hopefully you've enjoyed finding out a bit more about it as well. I think my takeaway from this kaupapa is the power and the magic in Indigenous storytelling, and marrying the ability to marry that with innovation and collaboration has been a huge learning point for me here at Tokona Tiraki, and hopefully you've had a bit of a glimpse into that this morning. That's us. That's all from the Rangatahi team, but we're going to hand back over to Eru and Russ to continue with the webinar. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Thank you very much.
Eru, what an amazing team.
Yeah, they're pretty awesome, eh? Makes you feel, as an adult, makes you feel like such a failure.
Wow, yeah. Definitely they know their stuff, and so culturally grounded. It's just beautiful to see that. I'm also realizing, Eru, what a minuscule contribution CoCreative made to all this work. It's so rich and so multidimensional. And so I wanted to note to everyone, Eru and I are just going to kind of explore some things that maybe bringing up some things that came up in past conversations, but playing with the Te Kore Koreka framework a bit to see more of the nuance, and particularly hear, Eru, your story about where this was emerging from for you, because I know you had maybe a little bit of frustration or dissatisfaction with the dominant ways of doing things that were very present in your community and in New Zealand. So, you know, whatever you'd like to share about that. But I'm particularly interested in, because just coming off of hearing your team and that extraordinary presentation, just any story or snapshot or picture you have of what it's been like working with the young people on your team. Because I've noticed over time, they seem like the engine of the work there.
Yeah, I think, you know, probably that light bulb moment was saying, well, rather than borrowing or importing solutions from outside, how do we then trust ourselves and our own culture as a source of our own solutions? And there's also a practical element where just things like using our own traditions, it creates a story and it kind of cleans everything up. So if you look at tools and frameworks, we found those kind of messy because they're always useful in one point in the journey, but they don't really explain the end-to-end arc of a journey. So I think that was probably a game-changing moment for us once we kind of figured out that we should just trust ourselves and our own culture and look within, then everything kind of sorted itself out and cleans itself up. I think the rangatahi, most of those, started in April. So they're, 2 or 3 months into the journey. But what you can see is it's evolving at a much faster pace. And so one of the things we don't necessarily do so well as Māori is allow things to be free and agile and to adapt. And a lot of that comes from our history where we've had to scrap it out. Our people have had to fight tooth and nail for generations to get those opportunities. And so we also have part of that psyche is fear, and we pour concrete around our initiatives and our change approaches, and they become rigid. And so I think one of the things we've really noticed is, we started out with a desire to have an Indigenous approach to future making, reclaiming that wisdom of the past. And what's emerging over the last couple of months will be intergenerational, and to acknowledge that even what we see as success and how success is defined and what it means to be Indigenous and part of our tribal community, what that means for me as a 43-year-old is vastly different to what success being Indigenous and being a good tribal member and a good descendant and eventually good ancestor looks like for the next generation below. And when we think of those phases of te ao, like te ao to me is kind of like, that it's the adults, we're just so stuck in the busyness. Te kore can be like our grandparents, our elders, that have the wisdom of the past, but can often sometimes get stuck there. And te pō is very much, where our young people are at. We're not coming into this kind of work with 20 or 30 years of institutionalized baggage. They're ready to rock and roll, and it's really inspiring. But I also think you could even hear that to go, well, where they take things is going to be up to them. And part of our role as pakeke, as adults, is to create the conditions for them to do their thing. And I think, wisdom and having 20, 30 years experience engaging with big institutions and government and communities comes in handy every now and then. But you can't beat the audacity of youth. And I think, their cultural confidence is inspiring. And I'm raising a couple of first language speaking kids, but how their lens of the world is entirely different from my own, even as a fluent speaker. So I think, we're raising them to, in a way which they're used to, more accustomed to, our culture being a living, visible, present part of our society. And so I think what we're now trying to figure out is how do we extend that into innovation and into change.
So you talked before about Te Kore Korenga being a kind of an inherently intergenerational framework, right? So you have Te Ao, and that's, primarily where adults live. Like we're doing our jobs, we're making money, we're taking care of business, everyday life, right? And what I've noticed is even in collaborations we support, most of the people in the collaboration are those adults, right? And so they're very grounded in Te Ao. And very rarely do we have youth or elders in those collaborations. And as you're noting, they represent these other realms in ways that adults don't, right? So when we have youth participate, they bring that energy of possibility, et cetera. When we have elders, they bring the wisdom and the groundedness and the connection to the knowledge of the past. How has that played out for you? Have you been able to do like really intergenerational processes so far?
So I suppose at the start, and you kind of heard them talk about the positives and negatives of those aos. End of the day in Te Ao Tura, you got to do stuff. You got to earn a living and things like that. But it's really easy to get stuck there. And so I think what we sort of started to map out were, what are those thresholds? Each ao has its own gravity, the realm, and you kind of get dragged back into the world of busyness. And when we look at our traditions, you kind of have these thresholds, the going through the cave into the underworld and crossing into the world of Te Pō. And you often have these deities that are kind of guardians on either side of that threshold. And so that's the sort of work we're trying to understand now. So I suppose, what are the kind of characteristics that can help you build momentum so you can make that shift. And so some of that is, the diversity of having thinkers and doers. Like I'm a thinker, so te kore is my happy place. I also get quite easily stuck there and never do anything. So, how do you build teams that have that diversity of skill? But even thinking in a generational sense, that, the challenge for often Pakeke is to step out of the present into the past. But, when we have the inclusion of different generations, then you have ones that are intrinsically attuned to our ancestral past and wisdom. You have young people that are intrinsically attuned to te pō, and they don't need to step into reflection and to unpack the last 100 years of what we've been doing. They're ready to go. And so, there's a need to look back, and we have lots of whakatauki or proverbs like ka mua, ka muri, looking back to move forward. So that's a critical part, but I suppose it's just saying that, that different generations are attuned to different ao, and when you have that inclusion, then you have a much more balanced approach, and that those different generations can help the others shift and transition from one ao to another. And again, ultimately, we always need to move the waka forward or move the canoe forward and get back to te ao marama. So this isn't about sort of, too lofty, philosophical, meandering. It's our people, we have big, serious issues. We need to make change and we need to have an impact. And so how do we build that reflection, the design, and then translate that into the world of doing stuff and actionable change?
So in the four realms, you talked about the deities representing the energy of each of the realms, and kind of in a sense the diversity that you need in the room, like those different energies and those different kind of orientations that people bring. And I imagine you could have a person my age who loves to hang out in te pō, right? All these people who love futuring, and they love doing all that future casting and prototyping and things like that. So can you say more about like the deities metaphor? Because I know that's just emerging. How is that informing your work or opening up different possibilities in the work?
We're still figuring that one out, Russ.
Yeah.
What I would say is, again, looking back to move forward and even thinking of innovation to go, well, who led transformation in our traditions and our past? What were those? All of our cultures have that kind of trickster hero type character. Whether it be Māori or Tāwhaki. So all of our cultural traditions have those traits. And so I think that's something we're starting to build into. And I think moving from that conceptual to practical, sort of complexity or systemic to human as well. Because some of us, we do need to navigate complexity, but also, how do you have something that can speak to an accountant, that can speak to an artist? And I think that's the beauty of our traditions, and that they resonate in some ways simple and clean, but they also have depth and codified meaning. And what we found, particularly with the multitude of linear innovation process models and collaborative frameworks, is that they get a bit geeky and lots of big words. And if you start talking to our communities about, navigating ambiguity or ideation or nodes and connectors, and everyone starts getting pretty grumpy pretty quick. But our people know complexity and interconnectedness. And if you look at our taiao, our environment, these are beautiful metaphors that are culturally ingrained and embedded within our traditions around interconnectedness and how things can support each other and how you create healthy ecosystems, of order, of well-being. So again, I think that's just more sort of being smart enough to look back and to go, well, what were the characteristics and traits that were successful for transformation in our past and change and adaptation, and how do we then draw them into our future?
So I almost hate to ask this as a counterpoint. What were the kind of aspects of the colonized approaches to change and even just community work more broadly that you were seeing that really weren't working?
I think, yeah, that's a tricky question. You even have well-intended but ultimately racist approaches. And again, I wouldn't differentiate between the intent versus the impact. So even in a lot of those frameworks or approaches or well-intended people with good intentions, you still have a lot of that where the community, or how would I say it, that people, that kind of white savior complex, and come riding in on a big white horse with a big white process to save our community. And that's actually not an original idea, it's not innovative. We've tried that for a couple 100 years. And in many cases too, where you are having the people that design the problem to be charging an Indigenous community to design the solution to the problem they created. And this is where we've got to start to address some of those power dynamics. And even when we talk about treaty partnership, or what's emerging for us is this idea of treaty-based innovation. To go, we still think we need an Indigenous process, an Indigenous team to be entirely facilitated in an Indigenous space for us to have any chance of mediating that imbalance of power. And so, continuing to privilege, Western non-Indigenous processes to solve problems Western non-Indigenous processes created is not an innovation. We've done that, we've tried that. I think what's really interesting is having an Indigenous process team and approach is really inspiring for our people, and our people seem to kind of get that pretty quickly, but it's also really inspiring for non-Indigenous people, for the well-intended. And it kind of gives a nice sort of cultural fix as well. And as I said, we're applying this across, 20, 30 odd projects. We're learning as we go. But as we figure out how does an Indigenous innovation process make us more Indigenous, it's also really interesting to think around how does it make tangata tiriti and a non-Indigenous people more connected to place, to their cultural identity, and to figure out how to be really good treaty partners.
I'm sensing Mulaney's presence because Mulaney has shared some of the same insights and patterns and observations. So I'm looking forward to another session the three of us will be in together tomorrow. Andrew, I just want to check with you, and I know there was an offer from one of your team members. Are there any kind of constraints on people taking forward what you've shared here, like cultural permissions, anything like that?
Yeah, we haven't, we'll probably sort of, I suppose, launch or start to put out some writing at towards the end of the year. So I suppose a key thing for us is this is really emerging, and we're still figuring out how do we go deep and build capability amongst their own people first, before we start to think around how does that spread. So, and I suppose that the key thing again is, if we come back to other Indigenous groups, probably the thing we can think of is just sharing that story of how did we go about trusting ourselves and trying to figure it out in our own way. Because again, it's not Māori colonizing other Indigenous groups. It's about saying, well, yeah, there's a missing piece in this puzzle. And when we talk about racial equity, we're still not, there's social innovation towards racial equity. The missing piece is, well, what about an Indigenous dynamic, and there are different purposes and agenda there, and that hasn't been prominent from our view at the bottom of the world. And so I think it's important to start that kind of conversation. I think it's also important to start to look at, how Indigenous approaches can create meaning and, for non-Indigenous peoples as well. And I think that has to be led by the home people. We can't be doing that work in other countries or in other places. But I think too, we have a lot of work to do just around those cultural permissions and just building trust. So we've actually been probably working on that process for 2 years and just been slow and slicing it into different projects and working with our own people. And I mean, ultimately, if we don't do this kind of work, then we're reliant on following and borrowing the ideas of others. And it's not to say there isn't value with that, but there is a whole lot more meaning when we look to ourselves, draw upon our own culture, and start to build from place, as opposed to importing. So, as I said, in that mind mappy thing, it's not to say we don't get inspired and steal and borrow ideas, but also that how do we build that into our own cultural worldview as opposed to be assimilated by a tool or anything like that.
Thank you for sharing, Eru. So I want to invite folks, you can come back to Slido, slido.com. The event code is Kiora, Kiaora. Melissa put a link into the chat. And just maybe take a minute to reflect on what you're becoming more aware of now. And that could be something related to Te Kora Korika. It could be some reflection on your own work or approach, whatever that is. And you'll note that when you get into the poll, you'll be able to see what others are contributing and also upvote anything else that resonates with you. So we'll be able to just see what's emerging in our thinking as a group, as well as individually. Eru, I'll ask you in a minute about darkness and Te Kore. Seems like there's interest in that. Feel free to continue to share. I'm just going to share the screen so we can see what's coming up here. So a number of people, the need for darkness, importance of cross-generational involvement, needing to pass through the unknown in order to shift. As a white woman doing community research, how can I be a good treaty partner? Some resonance here, Eru, with that using colonized approaches, right? We could be doing justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, all that, and still be doing it in colonized ways, right? So, Eru, would you mind sharing a bit more about Te Kore and that kind of realm of darkness?
I think, well, just in our traditions, when we have, calamities or big problems, they don't solve that from kind of the world of the living. So they always cross that threshold. And so in some of our traditions, even like with ones like tāwhaki, that they have a big problem, so they go off and cross the void into Te Kore, and they go on a journey. And, if anyone's familiar with Joseph Campbell's Hero of 1,000 Faces, it's quite common across cultures, that you don't solve it from your porch, you go off on that journey and you release yourself from your ties to the known world and you cross into the unknown. And so lots of our traditions speak of going into underworld and different sort of taniwha or kaitiaki guardians that sort of mark that threshold and can either be a block or a booster, or similarly, you know, ascending to the heavens, particularly with tāwhaki and the search of new knowledge, new potential. And so I suppose when you think about things like te pō, I think it's a good metaphor because it's darkness, and to go, you know, innovation is unlocking more value, but you're in a space of ambiguity. And that always sounds, I suppose, yeah, people associate innovation with technological invention, creating a new thing, but that doesn't really kind of counter focus on that inward journey of change. And again, we're not trying to use an Indigenous approach to invent the next iPhone. To go, well, actually, this is more complex, and it's around transformation, and, you know, acknowledging that we need to transform ourselves as part of that process. And so I think that space of te pō is just where things can kind of germinate and new potential can emerge. So, you know, te kore for us is really that space of release, of letting go, and te pō is really starting with a clear deck, so that you can actually let new things emerge. And so much of what we found when we did a lot of our, we call wānanga, or sort of, I suppose you call them like a retreat, I guess, is, yeah, innovation for most people meant adding a new thing on top of what they were already doing and creating more pressures on their time. And what we kind of figured out was that, yeah, what we were lacking often was a way in which we could let things go. You know, if te pō is the midwife of change, we need a good process to let things die, and to let things die with respect, to be released, and to free up energy and potential. And again, if you're trying to create when you've still got 50 to 60 hours plus a week of work to do, you know, it's not going to work, and it's going to be incremental, not transformational. So I suppose, how do we have a process to release ourselves from the things that aren't working in order to free ourselves to be able to explore new possibilities and new potential? And it's scary as hell for most people. That's the reality. And I think hopefully, you know, with the cycles, we at least kind of go, well, we'll get through this, and there is a process, and we have to have faith in ourselves and faith in the stories of our ancestors around how they navigated complexity, but also, you know, created transformation for their communities.
Thank you. So I'm going to add Melanie, if that's okay, to the spotlight. Melanie, I'm going to ask you to share a bit about Turtle Island. I know a lot of this resonated. I know enough of it from your sharing in the past. And I want to appreciate folks through your registrations and the donations. We were able to raise about $2,300 US for Turtle Island Institute. I think full of love and support and encouragement. It's not just the dollars, but I think respect and appreciation as well.
Miigwech, thank you, Ross. So I'm going to speak in Anishinaabe for a moment to introduce myself and to express my gratitude to Iru and the young folks that shared. Bojo and Dino Magan Duk, Apachigo Miigwech Bizindawayag, Wabskio Gichida Quays and Ang Indigenous, Waba Nang Aquay Indigenous, Moose in Dodem, Big Dagong Nishna Big Donjaba, Kitagonzi Big Donjaba, Malani Indigenous Jaganashi which Skakamakwe, Gimijiayang Nabish, Gimijiayang Majim, and Simon Nabogdanaki, Wade Nung, Wab Nung, Zhao Nung, Minwa Ninga Bianang. So I said, greetings to you, all of my relatives. It is an honor to be a part of this and to acknowledge your generosity. I'm the co-founder, and actually, no, I'm the founder and co-director of Turtle Island Institute. We're a global Indigenous social innovation think and do tank, but really we're a teaching lodge. We practice Gichiga Kinua Matawin, the act of greater deep teaching. Anishinaabe Kweyanda. I am Anishinaabe, also known as a Chippewa or Ojibwe, and I'm here in Turtle Island, which is North America. And specifically, I am in Niagara Falls, the place of the thundering water in Ontario. This is traditional Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Three Fires Confederacy territory. And I just wanted to acknowledge and thank Iru and, for sharing what really resonates with us as well. We have a transformative change process, we're calling it for now, that we've been developing with our council of 13 elders. So we have clan mothers, Mi'kmaq clan mothers, Blackfoot elders, Algonquin elders, Haudenosaunee elders, and Anishinaabe elders working with us on this change process. And it really is a process that starts with biskaviing, which is returning to ourselves. So knowing who you are to navigate into the future. So a lot of what you shared really resonates. And I'll just wrap up by saying, I think that what we're doing, this kind of work, because I'm a systems geek, a big nerd. I study in my PhD, complexity, systems thinking, and resilience theory. And in doing the translation of the geekiness to our communities, I found the same thing. They get pretty cranky when I start throwing out basins of attraction and panarchy loops, until we translate it into our stories and into our language, into 3D models. The first thing the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk elders, will ask me is, where is the creator in that work? Where is the responsibility to the unborn faces that are in the earth looking up at us? What does that model you're working on, Mulaney, do? Or what does that project do for the unborn generations? And so we live in a time of prophecy. And the prophecy says that there would be the Ashkamandazig, the new people that would reawaken things that went to sleep because of colonialism, and that we would share that. We would share that with people who were non-Indigenous, but we're all Indigenous to Mother Earth and to the oceans, to the mountains. So I think that's a really powerful time, and I'm really happy to be a part of that work at a time when, our Māori brothers and sisters are doing the same kind of work and trusting our language and our stories and the land, the Manadug, calling on our spiritual helpers, the Manadug, to help us. That's such an important part of our work, I think, together. So thank you so much for everyone's generosity, for the audience here, the participants supporting our work. And we are hosting a youth and elders gathering this year. And so I think in light of the presentation today, it'd be wonderful to direct some of those donations to the work that we're doing with the young people on that gathering that's coming this fall. So, thank you for listening.
Miigwech Mulaney. Eru and Tokana Te Raki team, thank you so much. That was enriching and affirming. You can read the comments, and we're going to share the comments back out, as well as the insights that folks shared in Slido. But I hope the team understands how grateful we are and what respect we have for your work. I don't know if they're there. There they are. All right. All right. And Ems is there too. Ems didn't introduce herself, but where is she? There, okay. So how about, I'm gonna stop the spotlights here, and let's greet each other as human beings before we all leave this space together. If you don't have gallery view on, you can switch to that in Zoom. Please turn on your camera. We can see one another, however you want to greet everyone else. Andrea's doing a dance. That's a great way to greet people. Beautiful. Thank you for joining, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, everybody.
Gracias a todos.
Awesome.
Thank you. Kia ora ki mihi kia koutou katoa. Ngā mahara ki a koe.